Coronavirus has pushed the world to the level of near zero production in last quarter. Stock prices are limping along, housing sales have gone soft, and banks are pulling back from the risky loans. At the same time, global growth is slowing thanks to the trade war, Brexit, and problem in number of emerging market economies. Two-thirds of the business economists expect the next recession to occur by 2021, with half of the corporate chief financial officers anticipating that a downturn will begin next year. Using history as a guide, recession feels inevitable. Tide comes in and tides go out. The sun rises and the sun sets. The economy expands for a decade or so and then contracts. But using Australia as a guide, this cycle may not follow. The country's current expansion is nearing its 30-year mark and is now the longest in the modern economic history. This phenomena has led to the commentators to brand Australia as a miracle economy, the wonder down under, and the envy of the developed world. At least some of Australia's seemingly endless spell of growth is due to happenstance, luck, and idiosyncrasy. Where the country lies on the map, what kind of neighbors the country has, what does the budget profile looks like, what mineral deposit happens to lie underneath it. All these factors played their part in keeping Aussies afloat through economic tsunamis. Be it the East Asian crisis of 1998, or the dot-com burst of 2000, or the global financial crisis of 2007 and 8. Australians had blessings of God in terms of small but affluent migrants, huge natural resources, and huge backing of the West and China. And that's how Australians could bunk all these financial shocks. But let me hasten to add that it was also due to sound and deliberate government policies. And this miracle attributes to the Aussies holding lessons for other world countries around the world, including the United States and to some extent India. The question is, will government policy always win? Clearly the answer is no. But last 27 years of Australian economy do show that if you get policy right, you can be hit by quite a number of shocks, good or bad, and still maintain steady growth. First, let's understand the Australian economy. As opposed to many neighboring Southeast Asian countries, the process towards independence in Australia was relatively peaceful and thus did not have any significant negative impact on the economy and the standard of living in Australia. Most underrated dark horse of Australian economy is its mining sector, which is almost every time neglected. Mining has contributed to Australia's high level of economic growth from the gold rush in 1840s to the present day. The opportunities for large profits in pastoralism and mining attracted considerable amount of British capital, while expansion was supported by enormous government outlays for transport, communication, and urban infrastructure, which also depended heavily on British finance. As the economy expanded, large-scale immigration satisfied the growing demand for workers, especially after the end of convict transportation to the eastern mainland in 1840s. Australia's mining operations secured continued economic growth, and Western Australia itself benefited strongly from mining iron ore and gold from the 1960s and 1970s, which fueled the rise of suburbanization and consumerism in Western Australia. Some non-mining states and Australia's non-mining economy experienced a recession over time, but Australia's overall national economy grew consistently because of mining, because mining provided the blanket cover to national economy of Australia. Between 2010 and 2013, much of Australia's economic growth in Australia was attributed to the areas of the country where mining and resource-based industries and services were mostly located. Western Australia and the Northern Territory are the only states that have economic growth during 2012. Southern Australia experienced a recession at various times. The Southern Australia is more prone to global economic fluctuations. In 2012, Victoria, the state of Victoria in Australia, experienced a recession. In 2012, the government of Victoria cut 10% of all jobs in public services. The same period saw these trends reversed with West Australia and the Northern Territory, who are heavily dependent on mining. At the turn of current century, Australia experienced a significant mining boom. The mining sector's contribution to overall GDP grew from around 5% in 1993 to almost 8% in 2006. Along with mining, the service sector grew considerably as well, with property and business services in particular growing from 10% to 15% of GDP over the same period, making it the largest single component of the GDP. But the growth has been largely at the expense of the manufacturing sector, which in 2006 accounted for around 12% of the GDP. A decade earlier, it was the largest sector in the economy, accounting to over 15% of the GDP. Being hugely rich in natural resources, Australia is a major exporter of agricultural products, particularly wheat and wool, minerals such as iron ore and gold, and energy in the form of coal. Although agriculture and natural resources constitute only 3 and 5% of GDP respectively, they contribute substantially to Australia's. Moving on to our main theme of the video about what made Australia shake off its recession so easily. Well, the Australian government got their government policies pretty right. Last 27 years of Australian economy do show is that if you get your policies right, you can be hit by quite a number of shocks, good or bad, and still maintain steady growth. But wait. What does getting policy right looks like? Well, lesson 1. Fight recession right. Australian policymakers combated the 2008 global financial crisis more adeptly than ones in the United States or Europe. Australia implemented fiscal stimulus quickly and did not turn to budget austerity as the economy recovered. Budget austerity होता है कि जब आपकी इकोनॉमी रिकवर कर जाए तो आप जो गवर्नमेंट होता है वो खर्चा करना बंद कर देती है अपनी पब्लिक के ऊपर, वो ऑस्टेरिटी में आ जाती है, खर्चा करना कम कर देती है. बट ऑस्ट्रेलिया डिड नॉट डू दैट. ऑस्ट्रेलिया kept investing. As a result, Australia's growth rate dropped without its economy actually shrinking. Australia kept running. Just months out from the recession, congressional Republicans in the United States started pushing budget cuts. European governments started slashing spending too, requiring strict austerity measures in the continent's debt-laden peripheral economies, Greece and Turkey, etc. ये वही किया उन्होंने जो ऑस्ट्रेलिया ने नहीं किया. बजट ऑस्टेरिटी मेजर्स अपना लिए यूरोप ने और अमेरिका ने, अपने बजट कट कर दिए, गवर्नमेंट ने स्पेंडिंग कम कर दी लोगों के ऊपर, जिससे लोगों के हाथ में बहुत लिमिटेड अमाउंट रह गया. जबकि ऑस्ट्रेलिया ने ऐसा नहीं किया. ऑस्ट्रेलिया गेव लॉट ऑफ मनी टू इट्स पीपल. ऑस्ट्रेलिया on contrary showered helicopter money on lower income households, tax cuts, rebates, subsidies. It gave heavily to its people. It spent heavily on infrastructure and debated balancing the budget without ever really moving to do so. Australia increased its expenditure. It spent $11 billion just a few days after the Lehman Brothers collapsed in 2008, and that triggered the American global financial crisis. Addendum to the lesson 1. Don't get into the mess to begin with. Australia had an easier recession to combat because the country had avoided the subprime lending, meaning that its households were not as overextended with debt and its financial institutions were not as heavily invested in exotica as those in the United States, just like Indian financial institutions. The Australian sector in Australia, the financial sector in Australia is quite different and it's boring. It mostly involved in bread and butter banking issues just like India, and that pretty much removes one source of big trouble, as not being excessively exposed to risk is a helpful thing, right? अमेरिका ने एक्सेसिवली लोन दिए लोगों को, जिसको 1 करोड़ का लोन चाहिए था उसको 5 करोड़ का लोन दिया. बट ऑस्ट्रेलिया एंड इंडिया and other Japanese countries other countries like Japan and China, they did not do such a thing. They spent what they needed the money for, not excessively. Lesson 2, welcome immigrant. Well, this lesson is definitely not for India. We are overly populated. But for other big developed countries, this could be a big remedy. More than a quarter of Australians were born abroad. 1/4 of all Americans are born abroad. It is doubled the rate in the United States or France. In recent years, the country's population has grown twice as fast as the United States population has. Given that Australia's immigrants tend to be younger than its native-born population, those numbers have helped improve the country's fiscal outlook and bolstered its government coffers, expanded its working age population and lowered its median age. They have also helped power it out of soft patches recession free. Well, here the economic math is not that complicated. More people means more investment, and more consumption means less chance of a downturn. Lesson 3, open up to the world. Australia has benefited from being in a rapidly developing neighborhood close to Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, and especially China. The growth has fueled Australia's growth. With the higher income economy exporting commodities as well as other goods and services to those lower income countries, trade between China and Australia alone increased tenfold in 2000s. With Australian export to China booming and Chinese investing heavily in Australia. As we have discussed above, though that has brought some really troublesome repercussions that Australia wants to deal right now. Openness to trade and investment has been a huge part of Australia's growth story. As protectionism has made a bit of comeback, Aussies have continued to promote and negotiate free trade agreements. In Australia, they just simply can't afford to do anything else. The economy that they are, the size that they are, and where they are positioned, that's the only option they are left with. They have to be open to the trade and investment. They just can't afford to lose that openness. They cannot afford a Donald Trump, which Scott Morrison is not. None of this means that the country has somehow managed to vanquish the business cycle entirely. Indeed, some forecasters anticipate a soft patch or even a recession ahead due to a correction in the housing market. Housing market is carrying a big gump for Australia. Nor does it mean that the Australian economy has been problem-free for 3 decades. Wages have stagnated, for instance. But it does demonstrate that recessions are always due to something. Many times, something that policymakers can fight. And it does demonstrate that smart governance is largely, if not wholly, determinative of a country's growth path. Whenever the next recession strikes, whether this year or next year or 3 years from now, there likely would have been a way to lessen or prevent it. There likely will be a best way to fight it. Because recessions are often a product of human frailty, not fate.